everyone, I'm Hannah from Hand Jan Crochet and I am stopping by to have a chat with you about stitches that we use in crochet garments. Now, the stitch patterns that we as designers choose to use are dependent on so many different factors, but I just thought it would be really good fun, for want of a better word, to have a little look at different types of stitches, what they offer to the fabric of the garment, and then also how you can think about what stitches might suit you, which stitches might be good for what kind of garments that you're making, how to add texture, how to make things look knit look. We're just going to have a look at lots of different stitches, and the other great thing about this is it doesn't just apply to garments. It can apply to any crocheted item that you would like to make. So let's just have a whistle-stop tour of lots of different types of stitches that we might like to use. So what I thought might be helpful would be to look at lots of different stitches and then think about the yarn that we've used for them, think about what the stitch offers to the garment, and kind of just look at what the options are, really, just to give you more of an idea of what we as designers think about when we're choosing a stitch for a design and how it affects all sorts of things within the garment. So as I'm sure you know, there are so many factors and variables that go into designing crochet garments, and those variables can be anything from the construction of the item, to the stitch that we choose to use, to the yarn, the size of hook that we use with that yarn to get the drape that we want, so how wiggly your fabric is, to the texture of it, to the colours in it, to so many different factors that we think of. But when you boil it down, it really does come down to the look of the piece is dictated by the stitch. And there are so many different stitches and types of combinations of stitches that we can use to achieve different looks and different styles, and that work better with certain yarns and work better with certain constructions. So I've kind of broadly broken down, I've basically got every single crochet item I own out of my cupboard, and I've broken them down into types, basically stitches that work for different things. So we have a set of basically like knit look stitches, that kind of ribbed and knitted looks here. We've got some closed stitches that everything kind of overlaps, really, because the closed stitches generally fit into the textured stitches as well. But this is textured. This is what I've called a textured stitch. And then this then overlaps into like the open work or lacy stitches, which I've classed as this one. But then you see this one uses lacy and open work stitches, but then has closed simple stitches down here at the bottom. So there's no hard and fast rules. You don't have to use the same type of stitches for the entire garment. And they can be a mixture of different stitches, as in they can be textured but also open. They can be textured but closed. So as you see, there's lots of different variables here. And of course, the last variable that we need to think about is colour as well, because although that's not technically part of your stitch pattern, it has a huge impact on your finished garment. And obviously there's different colour work techniques, but if you just use simple changes of colour, it can massively change what your stitch looks like. So here we have just a basic granny square, which has an open and lacy feel, and so therefore a beautiful drape to it. But the use of colour in this is what makes the stitch sing, because it's a really simple stitch pattern. So you have to think about all these things, and this is one of the things that I'd encourage you to think about when you make your garments, is what you can achieve, what you can change about the pattern. I'm not saying you need to change everything, but what can you change to make it suit you? Do you need to add some different colours in? And if you want to add colours in, will that work with the stitches that the garment has in it? Now, an example of this is using my Harris sweater here. Now this is worked side across, so if you want to work colours within this, you'll end up with vertical stripes, which might not be ideal. So if you're thinking about adding colour into make your stitches pop, you need to think carefully about the construction that you have within your garment to see if that's actually going to work and it's going to look like you would like it to be. So let's have a look at these different options. Let's think about the stitches that we can use. Let's have a chat about yarn. Let's think about how we could introduce colour into them and just have a little play basically with crochet stitches. So let's start by looking at some of my crochet garments that look like they're a bit knitted. Now this is a really simple place to start, and a really good place to start, I think, with crocheting garments, because all of the stitches that they use are really simple. So this one here, this crop cardigan, it has basically extended half double crochets and slip stitches in the whole thing. It hardly uses any variation in stitches, because actually what we're looking for is that classic look of knitted stitches. As you may or may not know, crochet naturally produces a denser fabric than knitting because of the extra loops that we create. And so what we're doing here in these stitches is trying to avoid that. We use slip stitches and different loops of stitches to make these ridges pop forward, to add some texture, so they also fit into that textured bracket, but they just have a slightly looser feel because you're working into the loops as opposed to the full stitch. So you can adjust how dense the fabric is by changing the stitches and making them less dense than they would normally be. And of course, the other thing to say is that as a designer, we work very hard to make sure that the drape is exactly as you would want it to be for a wearable. And even though this is worked in worsted weight yarn, because of the stitch that I've chosen to use here and the size of hook and the type of yarn that I'm using, is actually a really fairly thin and flexible fabric. So it's not too stiff and starchy at all. But then I did want to make quite a structured collar here, so it's actually doubled over. It's worked double and it's flipped over on itself to give you this really nice firm neckline here. So that's another way that we can use stitches. We can use them to our advantage by making the fabric thicker or thinner. Another example I have for you here is a really simple, she says, and it is simple, apart from the ruffles, it's a really simple sweater here. And it works in side across rows, but it uses these really long stitches. So it almost has an open look to it, because you can almost, but it does give good coverage. You don't have to wear anything underneath it. So it's not holey, but it is, it feels lacy and it feels light. So this again is a bit knit look, and it's because we are using the fronts and back loops of stitches as we go along, and it's giving those vertical lines. And although I made and designed this obviously in a tweedy wool here and put sleeves on it, I think this stitch would also work really well for a lightweight summer top or sweater, because you could just easily switch this out for a lightweight cotton or a lightweight wool, and that would be really lovely. So the same stitch, but changed slightly to use either a slightly looser gauge or a different yarn fibre, can absolutely change the entire garment. Then we have a really classic knit look here, which is using half double crochets in the back loop only. So really super beginner friendly. And this has shaping here at the top as well, which is a great thing that we can do when working is side to side and using these simple stitches in different loops. We can add shaping here at the sleeves as well. That's what these stitches let us do. And this does give us a denser fabric. It's a warmer, cozier thing, and it's very much more closed than some of the others. But as you can see, the drape of this fabric, this stitch gives it a beautiful drape and a beautiful stretch. So that's another really lovely simple one that you can make. And then lastly on the knit look, I wanted to show you this one, which is new to me. And it's using almost like a faux knit cable. And as all the others, we've been using vertical rows. We've been going up and down. This one actually works across in rows. And so you've got your knit look, but it's running the opposite way, which is very unusual if it's going to look knitted. in inverted commas. But this is using lots of yarn over slip stitches, which if you haven't used before, you really should explore, because they're absolutely brilliant for adding these pops of texture and working these short row cables here, which are definitely not as tricky as they look. There's nothing more complicated than this 6-stitch repeat here, and once you have it, you absolutely have it. And again, this then gives you a really nice closed stitch, but with beautiful drape. And again, this is in worsted weight yarn, but it doesn't feel heavy, it doesn't feel too much. And these stitches here, they are just half double crochet stitches, and it's just what variation we use them in that gives us the fabric that we want. So now on to our examples of more closed stitches. Although this does look a bit knit look, this one is really simple. It literally does just use half double crochet stitches, and it's just completely closed. It's the same stitch the whole way through, but the star of the show here is the yarn. And so it's really important that when you're choosing yarn colours, you pair them with the fabric that you're making and with the stitch that the pattern has in it. Because, for example, I don't think that this yarn that I've used here would work very well for this top, because there's so much detail and you want this stitch definition, you want to be able to see these cables pop out, and if you use this Tweedy yarn, you just wouldn't see, it would get lost in them. So the thing about the stitches is, although you've chosen a pattern that you absolutely love, make sure you then choose a yarn that would work really well with that stitch pattern. Now here we have another example of a closed stitch, but one that is nice and textured. Now this is worked in fingering weight yarn, and you can see how lovely and soft and pliable it is. But all we need to do here is work in different loops of that half double crochet to achieve this textured fabric here. So it's really lovely for beginners, really nice and simple make. But the difference is amazing, because these stitches, I think, would get lost again in a Tweedy yarn or a variegated yarn, or I think you would just lose the essence of the garment. So I think it's really important to pair the yarn you choose with the garment that you're making and the stitch that it uses. And now the other thing I wanted to show you with this, so this is for used with a fingering weight yarn. I have in progress, with lots of ends on it, a worsted weight yarn version of the same stitch. Now I'm using I can't remember what yarn it is, but it's quite a fuzzy and fluffy yarn, and you can see that the stitch definition is absolutely there for these sections, but it is a little more lost in the other parts of the texture than on the fingering weight yarn, pardon me. So it's an interesting experiment, and I think it's definitely going to work, because yes, it's a different feel, but I really do like it as well. So that's the other thing, you can experiment as well. Have a swatch, have a see what you've got in your stash that might work for that stitch pattern. And now we're moving on to a bit of a hybrid, this one, because it is kind of knit look, it's kind of closed, but it's also kind of a little bit lacy. So this one again uses just front and back loops of simple stitches, so extended single crochet I believe in this one, and half double crochets. Really straightforward, really simple. But for this one, because I thought that the lace work in it, or they kind of hint at a lace work, could take it, I went for this yarn is heatherly, and this has kind of, as you can imagine, a heather kind of look to it, so it has different flecks within it. So the yarn itself has got texture, but so has the stitch. And I think you just have to be really mindful of how you put all of those different things together. So first of all, know what your pattern is telling you, know what your pattern suggests, and then figure out, because a designer will have absolutely spent forever and ever choosing the yarn for the design, and they'll have chosen it for so many different reasons that I would definitely recommend that you try and find one that is very similar. So now we can think about textured stitches, but obviously again this one has a bit of a crossover too, because the collar of it looks a bit knitted, and the texture here that we have comes from these puff stitches, but we also then have kind of like a lacy feel here, and it's quite open. And this is worked in a double knit, so a category 3 weight yarn, and it is just the lightest thing. There's hardly anything to it, which you wouldn't necessarily imagine from that. But I have paired it here with this yarn has a fleck of the undyed linen running through it. And I did that really intentionally because I wanted it to have more, but I also think this would work brilliantly well because of all the busyness in the stitches in a really plain solid yarn, but perhaps a brightly coloured solid yarn. And I really actually need to add that to my list to make because I think it would look awesome. So here we are with another example of textured stitches, which you wouldn't necessarily imagine it to be, but this is corner to corner. But it's a type of corner to corner that has extra holes in it, so it comes across into that lacy bracket as well. But it gives you the texture, but I think this one gives you the texture because of the yarn that I've used. Now this is using Colour Theory from Lion Brand, and it's just a really lovely big bouncy yarn, for want of a better way of saying it. But because of the bounce in the yarn, you see the stitches so very clearly, and they sit and they almost pop up themselves without you having to do anything. So this is another example of how choosing the right yarn will make the pattern look absolutely amazing compared to if you choose a yarn that just really doesn't suit the pattern. And now this one is my Florence sweater, and I absolutely wear this as you can probably see. And now this one, it goes over so many different ones again because it does have a knitted feel to the sleeves. It has texture with these massive cluster stitches here, and then it has the open work as well. And of course, this isn't one that you can wear, well, you could if you wanted to, but I wouldn't wear this one without anything underneath it, but it's so lovely for layering, and the amount of compliments that I get when I wear this is just amazing. But again, yarn choice wise, I wouldn't go with a busy yarn for this one. I wouldn't go, I would go with a solid colour, definitely, but I wouldn't go with anything variegated or anything that's got masses of tweedy look in it, or anything too busy in terms of yarn. I would keep it really simple, and that will make the texture sing much more, and it will pop. So now on to the more open stitches, and this one I wanted to show you because I think people think about open stitches just being for finer yarn or for summer tops and things like that, but actually this is like a cocoon cardigan, and it's in a really open cluster V-stitch, and it's just so simple to make and so easy to wear. I wear this one all the time, and it's made from worsted weight yarn, and so yes, it is thick yarn, but it's so soft and delicate because of that stitch that we've used here. So it really does make a difference to choose the right stitch for the right weight of yarn. So I think this just goes to show that you can use delicate lacy stitches with any weight of yarn. There are fortunately no rules in crochet. You can do pretty much what you like as long as you like the end result. So go for it, I say. But then of course we do have the typical cotton yarn that gets used for lacy stitches, and so this is kind of like a beachy cover-up top, and it uses really simple stitches in what we call filet crochet. So you have chain spaces and stitches, and they create this design. And again, I've used really long stitches here to create that open, easy feel. And the cotton generally makes things a bit heavier, so that's why lots of things that are made in cotton seem to be quite holey and quite lacy, because if you had closed stitches using cotton, it would be extremely heavy. So this is again obviously to be worn over the top of things, but it's a really simple make and a really lovely texture of feeling to it. And now this one here is a really simple summer cardigan, and this one uses a really basic open stitch. It's a crossed over double crochet, and the great thing about this is that the yarn does the work for you. It uses this colour work yarn that grades itself from one end of the ball to the other end of the ball, and so you can get away with this really simple stitch, and so you make this really, really simple stitch look really, really complicated by using this yarn. So this is another example of how choosing the right yarn for it can completely transform the garment. Now, this will look absolutely beautiful in a solid colour or in stripes or in colourwork or however you want to do it, but I think this pattern lends itself brilliantly to this kind of yarn that actually self-colour changes, and it means not as many ends. Hurrah! And I'm also going to show you this one, which has filet crochet in it as well, but there's a few differences with this one in that you may have noticed I don't use lots and lots of colours. I use mainly neutrals in my work, but actually sometimes the colours, the bold colours, do work really, really well, I think. And this uses filet crochet, but the interesting thing is that this is a fingering weight yarn, but it is 100% wool, which you would think is unusual for a summer top, but it works brilliantly with this stitch, with this whole pattern, and to be a really light summer top. So again, it's that magic formula of the right stitch, the right yarn, the right drape, the right pattern. It's all a big melting pot, and great, great fun to find the right one. And so the last few ones I wanted to share with you are about colour positioning and choice. So this one here is really, really, again, really simple stitches. It's kind of a moss stitch type affair. And it uses just one colour per row, so it's nowhere near as tricky as it looks. But I went for a really, really neutral palette here, just to make these blocks more geometric and pop a bit more. But really interestingly, I then designed this next one underneath in a very, very similar stitches, exactly the same concept of the stitch, but just look at how the different use of colour makes it entirely different. You would never believe that that is the same stitch, but you could easily switch these two. You could easily put the brights in this one and it would just look, again, entirely different. And so similarly for this one, you could use neutral colours, or you could use a variegated yarn that self colours and self stripes. So it would look entirely different again. So the last two to show you are the good old granny square, and I think these two just give you a really good idea of how switching colours within the same stitch can just completely transform it. And I mean, I know they're different construction and everything, and different sizings and so on, but the essence is still the same. The texture of the stitch is still the same. The idea behind it, the openness and that of the stitches is exactly the same. But colour is so powerful when it comes to stitches and how it makes them look. And so what I would encourage you to do is have a play and have a think. Do some swatches of any kind of patterns that you have and play with colours. Figure out which types of yarn work for those stitches, how your drape feels when you work that. Have a play, and you will just understand so much more. And the process then of choosing a pattern with a stitch that works for you, and then the colour palette that works for you, will be just so much easier in the future. So I hope that's given you a bit of insight into what we as designers think about when we choose a stitch pattern for a garment, or indeed any crochet pattern. There are so many factors that go into it, but it's great when you can break them down and show exactly what they're good for, exactly what they work for, and kind of what yarns it works well in, and all that kind of stuff. So I hope it's been helpful, and if you have any questions or any queries, then please do get in contact with me. I'll leave all my details below, and I will speak to you again soon.